to Transformation in Trials. Welcome to Transformation in Trials. This is a podcast exploring all things transformational in clinical trials. Nothing is off limits on the show, and we will have guests from the whole spectrum of the clinical trials community. And we're your hosts, Ivana and Sam. Welcome to another episode of Transformation in Trials. Today in the studio, we have Ravi Samavedam with us, who is the Chief Innovation Officer at Azzur Group. Hi, Ravi.
Hi, Ivana.
Well, we are really excited about this conversation where we're going to dive into on-demand clean rooms for clinical trial supply. And Ravi, just to get us started, can you tell us more about what is the standard practice for producing material for clinical trial supply?
Sure. First of all, thank you for the opportunity, Ivana. Very glad to be here. Greetings, everybody who's listening in or watching the video. So the traditional approaches to GMP manufacturing, especially for clinical material, is really twofold. One, you build your own infrastructure, internalize manufacturing by hiring all the employees, establishing all the quality management systems, getting all the electronic systems in place, getting everything qualified, and then starting into GMP manufacturing. That effort takes a lot of time, 18 to 24 months minimum for a build project, and it takes millions of dollars, obviously. The other approach to clinical manufacturing traditionally has been outsourcing, right? So that would be a contract development manufacturing organization, CDMO or a CMO that would take the process off your hands, take the ownership of the product quality of the batches, and then hopefully make good product at the end of the day. Now, about 80 to 90%, especially of the novel therapeutics that we are seeing, cell and gene therapy, still rely pretty heavily on contract manufacturers. But the challenge there is, there's a pretty big waiting list, especially when it comes to good third parties, good CDMOs, in the novel spaces, especially cell and gene therapy, for example. So that, again, is a huge challenge for a company that has a great, good science, good molecule, but really has to wait for that manufacturing slot to show up. The other challenge that both options have, both of those traditional options, is that the utilization of the facility that you build early on in your clinical life cycle is not that high, right? You don't need, a batch every single week or a batch every single month. You're making a few batches that will go into the clinic and you're waiting for the results, right? So that first option of going and building your own facility and internalize manufacturing really does not make sense this early on in the product life cycle, unless you have just molecules that you're pumping out of that facility for clinical use, which is very rare. The second option, again, it's a challenge because from the CDMO's perspective, it's so much easier for them to go cater to the big pharma of the world that have hundreds of batches that required over maybe 2-3 years, as opposed to 1 or 2 batches that's required for a startup that may or may not succeed in the future. So there's a little bit of that as well. How do you convince the CDMO community to go cater to these small startups who have exciting innovations, but not necessarily the amount of volume that may be, sustainable from a CDMO standpoint, right? So because of those two issues, we saw that molecules were sort of stagnating without this manufacturing space, without the GMP infrastructure. That's when we decided to start this business called Clean Rooms on Demand. It's about 5 years old. That sits right between the two traditional options. So it's a hybrid model where companies keep their science to themselves. They don't have to outsource their actual technology to a third party, but at the same time can internalize manufacturing without owning a facility and without having the burden of maintaining it. And the way we do that is we build these GMP spaces that are amenable to early phase clinical manufacturing and eventually commercial manufacturing as well. And we use flexible designs, use of modular clean rooms, panel-based clean rooms that really makes it very easy for startups to flex and grow as they go from phase 1 to phase 2 and so on.
We have a pretty broad church of listeners. Ravi, could you tell us what is a clean room and why is that important for producing drugs for clinical trials?
Absolutely. So as you can imagine, anything that goes into human beings, whether it be for clinical trials or eventually for commercial use, has to be highly controlled just because of the nature of the substance, right? It's potentially an injectable that you're injecting into your body. So it has to be highly controlled, not just the manufacturing process, but also the environment. because the environment, an uncontrolled environment may result in contamination in a batch, which may impact the product quality, which may eventually impact the patient that's going to receive that therapy, which is why you need a very controlled space. One of those controls are the air quality within the room that the actual process is being executed. So that, typically is called a clean room, where you're maintaining the quality of the air to a certain limit. Now, there are various levels of cleanliness depending on the intended use of a given space. So, for example, if you're making the final dosage form, which is typically called the drug product, you need a higher level of control as opposed to an intermediate such as a drug substance or an API, which doesn't necessarily require the high level of control compared to a drug product manufacturing operation. So you have these requirements for these specific operations. So we are the experts who create these spaces and provide a plethora of support services, whether it be materials management, asset management, equipment maintenance, calibration, and the list goes on. The overall GMP compliance of the facility is a burden that we take on, while the clients that come and inhabit those clean rooms have the burden of just continuing the science that they're doing. And we create that GMP envelope so that even somebody who has not been doing GMP manufacturing can easily transition, to cross that step between preclinical and clinical manufacturing, which can be a pretty huge burden for startups who've never done it before.
And these clean rooms, Ravi, just want to come in on this point, if you don't mind. Are these clean rooms that are kind of specific to an individual clinical trial sponsor, or are they shared amongst a group of sponsors?
So the facility itself can have anywhere from 10 to 30 clean rooms, depending on the location. And it is a multi-product, multi-tenant, multi-client use facility. But then each individual clean room is dedicated to a single process, single client. Now, typically our clients come in for 12 months or more. That's kind of our minimum offering. But most of them stay much, much longer because they see the value in this sort of a model. But to answer your question, each clean room is dedicated for that individual client so that, there is no crossover between one process to another, of a different client or of a different company. The clean rooms themselves are also controlled in such a way that the air from one clean room core can never really enter another clean room core, so that you can have multi-product operations next door to each other with minimal risk of cross-contamination in terms of air. We've also used intelligent designs such as airlocks and sinks in the clean rooms themselves to, again, eliminate the possibility of the air from one clean room entering another clean room.
I was curious about how you came about understanding this whole problem in the first place. Like, I'm guessing you didn't just wake up one day and think, hey, I'm going to create a business all about clean rooms and solving the problems you talked about. So perhaps you can elaborate a bit more about that.
Yeah. Clean rooms and design is probably best described as a necessity that came out of the pains of our clients, right? And the way we discovered that is in 2015, 2016, we were doing consulting work for startups in Cambridge, where time and again we saw companies asking us to convert their conference room into a governing area, convert their labs into an ISO 7 manufacturing space. And we did do that for a couple of clients, but then we saw the non-sustainability of that, some of the GMP challenges of that, trying to pigeonhole a GMP facility in a high-rise in Cambridge. We did that a few times, but then we saw how long that process takes, how not sustainable that is, and how expensive it is. And at the end of the day, the molecule and the patients are suffering because of that wait time, right? Because of that build out or that remodification that you have to do. And we saw that 2-3 times in the Cambridge area. And that's when we decided, look, let's build a couple of clean rooms, provide all those GMP services, so that the next time a client asks us to do something silly, like converting their labs and their warehouses into clean rooms, we can offer our clean rooms as an on-demand solution. That was just a side project for us in 2017, but then it really took off in 2018 and 2019 when we realized that this is really a game changer for startups. Now, interestingly, while this model still works great for startups, we've realized that this also works great for the big pharmas, the bigger companies, if you will, that are not necessarily startups. So Moderna Therapeutics, and I can speak about this because this is public information, uses our Burlington, Massachusetts facility, and they came to us in 2020 requiring some overflow manufacturing capacity. So this, again, not just works for startups, but also companies that require overflow capacity because of a sudden need. It also works for CDMOs, right? While theoretically it sounds like our business model challenges the CDMO model, it really is not. It just provides another avenue for startups as well as CDMOs. We do have a couple of CDMOs in our portfolio of clients, and they use us as a bridge facility, right? While they are building their manufacturing capabilities, it takes time to build those facilities. In the meantime, they can use our infrastructure to actually make product for their clients in turn.
And I'm interested about this modularity of the facility that you mentioned, because it sounds like you can use it for many different cases and for many different kinds of customers. How do you change your clean room to suit different kinds of needs?
Yeah, so these are panel-based modular clean rooms. So, they're almost like Legos, where they, fit together and they get secured. So it's very easy to convert a room into two rooms. For example, you can connect multiple rooms. You can change, the gowning configuration in one room. You can change the anti-room configuration in the other room. So you can play around with it very easily and without having to demolish, having a demolition project, having a shutdown, having, drywall and all the issues that come with demolition projects. You can quickly convert these spaces. Now, it's very key for clients who will eventually, go from phase 1 to phase 2, right? There may be a need for a larger space. There may be a need for multiple spaces to be interconnected. So having this modularity in your facility gives that advantage for you to flex very easily in going from one phase of manufacturing to the other, as opposed to state-built facilities.
I'm also curious, what kind of real estate do you need to build these kinds of labs? Can you take any building and convert it into clean rooms, or do you have to purpose build each building?
Yeah, so there are some basic requirements like, the height of the facility. Since there are warehouses that coexist with the clean rooms, we definitely need high bay ceilings to accommodate for a lot of storage. It has to have a lot of power, obviously, for all the infrastructure that we will put in place. In addition to the clean room infrastructure, there's also the storage that we provide through the warehouses. So anywhere from ambient all the way to liquid nitrogen storage. So a lot of those units do require a lot of power. So that's one. We require certain, diameter of gas piping that comes into the facility, so that we have some basic requirements like that. But in general, a shell building with high ceilings that has some loading docks is like the bare minimum that we look at in addition to the utility requirements.
Another question. It's interesting to me to imagine how you have these scientists, both from sponsor companies, from small biotechs, from large biotechs, from CDMOs, all in one location. Have you had examples of like cross-pollination of ideas or innovation happening because you gather all kinds of different players in the same space?
It's interesting. The clients that we have, majority are cell and gene therapy. They're doing really novel work, so they're very secretive about their processes, right? So there is no necessarily cross-pollination or new innovations from clients interacting with each other. But we have come up with novel ways of accelerating manufacturing through our experience from our clients, multiple clients in a given facility. Yeah. So, confidentiality is something that's very important to our clients. We anonymize all the materials that come on site. Everybody gets an alphanumeric number that is anonymous. So, that number kind of stays with their equipment, with their materials, so that, nobody knows whose process is being executed next door.
So, Ravi, just to try and kind of paraphrase and check that I've fully understood the whole concept. If I'm a small emerging biotech working in gene therapy, for example, my traditional choices for manufacturing are I could build my own facility, but that's probably not going to be something that's an option just because it's expensive and it takes a long time. Or I outsource to a CDMO, CMO, but if I understood this correctly, you have to join the queue, right? And there could be many other people in front of you, and therefore that's going to delay your study startup times and ultimately your cycle times and anything connected to that. So Is that a fair representation?
Yeah, the other challenge with the CDMO model is you ultimately have to transfer your process, your knowledge from your organization to the other, which has potential failures there, right? And then, the flexibility is not there because you don't have total control over your destiny, right? You don't know when the next manufacturing slot is going to be available. If you get delayed for some reason and you have to change that slot, you may or may not get an immediate slot after that, right? So there are some inherent challenges to the outsourcing model. Now, don't get me wrong. There's it obviously works because there's so many CDMOs and there are so many virtual companies that don't have the wherewithal to go manufacture themselves. They don't have the wherewithal to go procure the equipment, right? Now, that's where we come in, right? We say, look, as long as you have, the molecule, the science behind it, we can help you procure equipment. We can even help you staff up. We can help you, pivot from a virtual company to a manufacturing company if that's your intent as well. So that's another, opportunity here that we're presenting to the industry, where you don't necessarily have to just rely on a third party because you don't have the wherewithal today. We can enable you with that. We can even potentially fund a startup from the equipment side of things with some royalties at the back end. So that's something new that we're exploring as well.
Do you have like an ideal customer profile when it comes to the sort of sponsor or CRO, I guess, that might be a good customer of yours, if you like, if you were to look at all of the different kind of variables and who would be the top targets, I guess, obviously not naming names, but in terms of size and type of sponsor that would benefit from the sort of services that you offer?
Absolutely. So, the vision of the business is really to accelerate critical therapies, right? And we see that the majority of activity that's happening, innovation that's happening, is in the cell and gene therapy space, is in that startup space. And our facilities are, by design, really well suited for those sort of operations. The other things I didn't mention about the facility is there are no drains. Everything is bagged in, bagged out. There's no stainless steel. There's no WFI generation. There's no cleaning. There's no steaming. So there's no place for bugs to really proliferate, right? So we have kept the overall risk profile of the facility pretty low that way. And that's by design. So inherently, our facilities sort of are well suited for cell and gene, high use of single-use disposable technologies. So hence, we automatically cater well to the cell and gene therapy community. Now, the other piece is we are able to maximize our value to the biotech industry by providing not just the clean rooms, but all the services, right? Whether it be the storage, the testing. So that's where the other divisions within Azzur, which I haven't really talked about, we started off as a consulting firm, right? So that's still about 50% of our workforce is in consulting. We have 13 consulting offices. We have 6 testing labs nationwide, right, that do microbiology, biochemistry testing, chemistry testing. So for us to really provide the most value from all of our divisions, the ideal clean rooms on demand client is a startup cell and gene therapy company. Startup, because that's where we can really help them with all of our services, and that's where the biggest need is that we see, right? That's where there are a lot of innovations are happening. That's where the roadblock is.
That's an interesting scenario, that's growing from the consulting space into the more hardware space. And also, I'm curious about this blend between potentially a biotech having some of their staff on site, but maybe also using some of the services that you offer. Can you talk to us more about, what different ways do you interact with a potential customer?
Yeah, so our model is very flexible, right? So if you're a startup that has nothing, for example, we can work with you on creating a GMP roadmap and then fill the gaps with our services, our personnel, our systems as much as possible, but with the ultimate goal of enabling you to become independent, right? So the idea is hopefully someday you'll want to internalize manufacturing completely, build your own facility, and run commercial operations out of there, which we can help through our consulting and testing divisions also, right? So that's really the long-term play, is to enable our clients to actually graduate. While we'd love our clients to stay as much as possible, we want them out. We want them to be successful and go out so we can accelerate another therapy, behind that, right? So that's really the goal, is to enable our clients, irrespective of their maturity. So, the big companies that come to us say, look, we don't even need your materials management services because we have our own group that does all of that. So be it. But for a startup that needs that, we provide that as a service. Same thing with procurement of materials or equipment. If they need that, we can actually procure process equipment on their behalf. Obviously, it needs to be well planned, and these days the lead times are pretty long, so it works well for good planners. So, but then to answer your question, it's a very flexible model designed to bring any sort of company into our portfolio.
Well, I love that you saw this specific spot that was missing in our industry. And I would like to know, is there any other area that you're currently curious about where you can see, well, there is something here that's missing? Maybe that would be the next thing that Azzur starts working towards. Do you want to share any of your thoughts in this area?
Well, I'd love to have some company develop clinical models that does not involve animals at all, right? Have some sort of models that will be, I'm not really the expert in that, but that'd be something cool to explore, not just from social responsibility, being good to animals and so on, but also might be a much faster way to get to the point where we need to get to as an industry, as opposed to reliance on animals for all the testing. That's one thing that I wish there were more companies investing in that, and maybe there are. I just haven't explored that a lot more. The other advancements that would be cool to see is more disposable technologies, right? More single-use technologies. While there are a lot that have come up in the last decade, I think there's still a lot of innovations that can happen that could accelerate product changeover, for example, that could accelerate connectivity between one facility to the other, or one unit operation to the other. The other thing that I think we will want to explore at some point as a company is, especially for autologous cell therapy, in order to reduce the vein to vein time. So, in autologous cell therapy, you're taking the cells from an individual patient, you're manipulating those cells in a manufacturing facility, and you're reintroducing those same cells back into that same patient. Now, today, 9 times out of 10, the cells are collected in some sort of a hospital, right? But then the manufacturing facility is somewhere else. So there's a transportation back and forth, there's potential risk there. But I think the future is where we have these clean room facilities next to the collection centers, right, in a hospital setting. That would really be cool, right? So you're doing the collection next door, genetic manipulation next door, bringing it back to that same room. How cool would that be? And maybe someday it's a bedside activity, right, where you have a clean room in a box. You're manufacturing unit operations in a box. That would be the ultimate goal.
I like that. The idea of having, clean rooms being something that has to be built in at the company, to having it in one facility, and then maybe even bringing it even closer to the processes where clean rooms are actually needed. That would be a super cool evolution. Well, Ravi, you talked to us a little bit about your background. Can you take us way back to how you started in this whole game, and how you made it to where you are today?
Sure. So I'm a biochemical engineer by education, and I have about, say, 25 years of experience in the industry. I started off at Baxter, mostly doing technical operations, manufacturing support. It's a little bit of process development, troubleshooting type of work. Then I worked at Amgen and Shire before I started consulting. At the end of my Shire stint in 2012, friends of mine who had started a consulting company in the West Coast reached out to me, and then I helped start the New England office for them. That was in 2012. And then eventually that company, BioSpec, merged with Azzur Group in 2014. So that's how I joined Azzur. Me and a colleague of mine, Chris Mansour, started the New England office for the companies after the merger. We grew that significantly. And like I mentioned, in 2015, 2016, we saw this trend of companies trying to pigeonhole clean rooms in Cambridge. And that's where, we started with this clean rooms on demand idea. So most of my industry experience before Azzur was commercialization of products, so process validation, regulatory submissions. So the final end of commercialization of products, mostly MAB, big molecule protein-based products. Ever since I started at Azzur, it's the extreme opposite. Acting as head of quality, acting as a project manager for GMP readiness, all for startups that have never done GMP. It's almost been exclusively that for the last 10, 12 years with my consulting career. So I've seen both the extremes. right? And I think the one key takeaway I found is, there's always a more conservative approach to GMP, right? It's where you want to draw the line, and that's where your phase appropriateness comes in, right? So it's very easy to go overboard in terms of GMP quality, but really the smart thing to do, especially for startups to be sustainable, is to know when to turn that GMP switch on, to the extreme, as opposed to doing it from the start.
That's a really good reflection to have. And that must be a hard point to find, especially if you're new to GMP. It does require some sort of GMP stamina to know where to draw that line.
Exactly. Yep. I mean, there are so many companies that go overboard with GMPs in the beginning, and it just creates roadblocks for themselves, unnecessary deviations, things that really may or may not even impact. Because that early on in a product life cycle, you don't have much process knowledge. You don't even really understand what's critical to product quality, because you're still developing those product quality attributes and in-process parameters and so on.
And Ravi, appreciate you sharing your background there. Fascinating background. I'm curious to understand if you're noticing any turbulence in the market, given current market conditions, some of the things that are going on from a even financial viewpoint. Are you seeing any kind of headwinds in the area that you're operating in?
Yeah, so we did see a slight slowdown, I'd say last quarter of last year and first quarter of this year, in terms of new companies, signing up into our existing, as well as new facilities that are coming online. So we did see a slowdown. And we're also seeing a lot of M&A activities, right? So a lot of our potential clients from last year certainly are part of a much bigger entity. Having said that, we feel this is a short-lived downturn, because with the flurry of M&A activity comes opportunities for us, because those big companies that have suddenly acquired these molecules still need some place to go and manufacture this, right? Unless they have existing capacity, which is rare these days, they have to go look at some other options. So I think we are sitting really, really well right now, positioned really well, with 3 new facilities coming online in the next 12 months. And our offering is really just gaining momentum in the industry. So I think this is going to be a pivotal year for us in terms of offering this, as an opportunity, as a acceleration opportunity to the industry this year. And I think this will define, this model as, sort of a, right next to those 2 traditional models, and firmly there is what my belief is.
And Ravi, the facilities that you currently have, as far as I understand, they're mostly in the US. Are there any plans to go to the rest of the world and build facilities there?
So we have 3 operational facilities, 2 in Boston, 1 in San Diego, and we're building 3 more in the US, 1 in North Carolina, 1 in San Francisco, and a third one in the Boston area. We have thought about EU, we've thought about Asia, but honestly, we want to exhaust all the hotbeds in the US first. We haven't looked at, Texas, Colorado, New York, Washington, DC, Maryland, Philadelphia. So there's still a lot of, hotbeds that we need to go into in the US, but we might look at a potential, acquisition opportunity as something that would accelerate our presence. And it doesn't necessarily have to be in the clean room space. It could be in the other divisions as well, whether it be labs or consulting.
I was curious to learn a bit more about what was next for Azzur. You touched upon possible plans, Ravi, there for acquisition. Anything else that you might want to share with our audience?
Yeah, so we are actively looking at what next in terms of clean rooms or demand sites. We do have a little bit of a gap in terms of the central US and northern US in terms of our consulting and lab presence. So we'll grow that for sure this year and next year. So, we don't have any presence in terms of consulting, resources in, say, Seattle or Minneapolis. So we want to grow that part of the US as well in terms of all of our services. But again, we are always looking for, adjacent opportunities, right? My role as a chief innovation officer is to look at potential adjacent businesses that we can either go into organically or acquire. So that's always, on our radars, potential companies that offer things that would add value to our overall portfolio.
And I would imagine, given the possible impact that your services can have on a sponsor organization, that what you're offering gets the attention of pretty senior people within these organizations. Who are your kind of typical stakeholders that would be interested in the services that you offer?
So we would like to actually speak to the C-suite before getting, in a partnership with any company, because it's a long-term relationship. It's a pretty significant relationship, right? Where we are enabling companies to get to clinic so much faster than traditional options. And it is, there's no cheap GMP option, right? It's either more expensive or less expensive. So we want to know, who we are talking to. We want them to clearly understand our value proposition at all levels, especially because it's a very novel concept. So we would like to have audience with the C-suite, but 9 times out of 10, the head of manufacturing, the VP of manufacturing, head of CMC, those are the roles, head of clinical development, head of process development. Those are the roles that we have first contact with. But eventually we do, almost force the issue, especially with startups, to have a conversation with our C-suite, with their C-suite, to understand, make sure there's alignment of expectations.
Very cool. No, I really enjoy doing this podcast because we get to learn a lot about possible areas of the pharma value chain that we're not exposed to in our day jobs, and this is certainly one area. And I've taken a lot from the discussion that we've had today. Ravi, as we wrap up this episode, we always ask our guests the same question at the end. And that question is, if there was one thing that you could change about our industry, what would that be?
One thing, I'll probably go back to my soapbox, which is learning how to be risk-based and how to be phase appropriate, right? I really think that could be a game changer. There are regulations out there, or there are industry guidances out there that kind of steer companies towards that phase appropriate mentality. But it is a culture shift that the industry has to take. It's fear-driven, right? It's so easy to be very, very conservative as a quality person. Take the most conservative route. You have nothing to lose. But that is not really appropriate especially for early phase, right? That's really creating roadblocks unnecessarily. That goes against our whole vision of accelerating critical therapy. So we would like to continue to somehow educate the industry that phase appropriateness, risk-based approach, and even getting the regulators on board with those sort of practices, and continue to write white papers and industry practices to drive that as a go-to, as the norm, as opposed to the opposite, which we see in a lot of our startups.
Very cool. No, I think it's a very noble point, and I'm sure our listeners will agree too. On that point, if our listeners want to get in touch and learn more about yourself and the great work that Azzur are doing, where should they reach out to find you?
So you guys can find us at www.azzur.com, AZZUR or AZZUR.com. There should be plenty of contacts there. There's also a virtual tour of our cleanrooms facility in San Diego. So we encourage you to take a look at that. So you should find all the contacts there for sure.
Awesome. Ravi, it's been an excellent conversation. This is obviously transformation in trials, and what you've described is certainly aligned with transforming how clinical trials can be conducted. So we appreciate your time, and we're looking forward to keeping in touch with you and seeing how yourself and Azzur progress on your journey. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sam. Thank you, Ivana.
You're listening to Transformation in Trials. If you have a suggestion for a guest for our show, reach out to Sam Parnell or Ivana Rosendahl on LinkedIn. You can find more episodes on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or in any other player. Remember to subscribe and get the episodes hot off the editor.